For over 2,000 years, Christians have claimed that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled dozens of ancient prophecies written centuries before his birth. These prophetic fulfillments form the backbone of Christian arguments for Jesus' messianic identity and divine mission. But how strong is this evidence? Can prophecies written hundreds of years before Jesus' time really prove his identity as the promised Messiah? Tonight, we're conducting a systematic investigation into biblical prophecy and its alleged fulfillment in Jesus Christ, examining the claims, the evidence, and the scholarly debates that continue to this day. The concept of messianic prophecy is rooted in the Hebrew Bible's vision of God's unfolding plan for human history, beginning with the promise to Abraham that all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The Hebrew scriptures contain numerous passages that later interpreters understood as predictions about a coming deliverer. These prophecies emerge from different historical periods, written by various authors facing diverse challenges. Yet they appear to paint a consistent portrait of a figure who would restore God's kingdom and establish justice on earth. The statistical argument for Jesus' prophetic fulfillment appears compelling at first glance. Scholar Peter Stoner calculated that the probability of any one person accidentally fulfilling just 8 major messianic prophecies would be 1 in 100 quadrillion, a number so astronomical that it would be virtually impossible without divine orchestration. But this statistical approach raises immediate questions. How do we define a genuine prophecy? How specific must a prediction be to constitute meaningful fulfillment? And how do we account for the possibility that gospel writers shape their narratives to align with prophetic expectations? Let's begin our investigation with the prophecy of Jesus' birthplace. Micah 5:2, written in the 8th century BC, declares, "But you, Bethlehem Ephraim, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." This prophecy is remarkably specific, naming not just a region or city, but the particular Bethlehem in Judah, distinguishing it from another Bethlehem in northern Israel. The Gospel of Matthew explicitly connects Jesus' birth to this prophecy, while Luke provides the historical context explaining why Jesus, who grew up in Nazareth, was born in Bethlehem. The Roman census that required Joseph to return to his ancestral home created the circumstances for the prophecy's fulfillment. Critics argue that the gospel writers may have invented or altered birth narratives to align with prophetic expectations. But supporters point out that claiming a Bethlehem birth for someone known to be from Nazareth would have been easily contradicted by contemporary witnesses. If it were false, archaeological evidence adds complexity to this discussion. Recent excavations in Bethlehem have confirmed that it was indeed a small village during the 1st century, matching Micah's description of its humble status. The discovery of ancient churches built over sites traditionally associated with Jesus' birth suggests that early Christian communities preserved specific geographical traditions. Though this doesn't necessarily prove their historical accuracy, the prophecy of the virgin birth presents both textual and theological challenges. Isaiah 7:14 states, "Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." Matthew's gospel cites this as a prophecy fulfilled in Jesus' conception. However, the Hebrew word alma hanmian eter vagin, or young woman, and the original context appears to address a sign for King Ahaz in the 8th century BC, not a distant messianic figure. Jewish interpreters have traditionally understood this passage as referring to a contemporary event in Isaiah's time, possibly the birth of King Hezekiah. Christian theologians argue for a dual fulfillment, an immediate historical application, and an ultimate messianic realization in Jesus. The Greek Septuagint translation, completed centuries before Jesus' birth, uses Parthenos virgin, suggesting that pre-Christian Jewish translators understood the passage in terms that would later support Christian claims. The prophecies surrounding Jesus' death present some of the most striking parallels between prediction and fulfillment. Psalm 22, traditionally attributed to David in the 10th century BC, contains detailed descriptions that closely match gospel accounts of crucifixion. "They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." What makes this particularly remarkable is that crucifixion wasn't practiced by the Israelites in David's time. It was a later Roman innovation. Yet the psalm describes details that wouldn't become historically relevant until centuries later. The specific mention of casting lots for garments finds exact fulfillment in John 19:24, where Roman soldiers gambled for Jesus' seamless tunic. Psalm 22 also captures the emotional and spiritual dimensions of Jesus' crucifixion experience. The opening words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" are the exact words Jesus spoke from the cross according to Matthew and Mark. The psalm's movement from anguish to triumph parallels the Christian understanding of crucifixion leading to resurrection victory. Isaiah 53, perhaps the most famous Messianic prophecy, presents what Christians see as a detailed portrait of Jesus' sacrificial death, written over 700 years before the crucifixion. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This passage describes a suffering servant who bears the sins of others, dies as a guilt offering, and ultimately sees vindication through his sacrifice. The parallels to Christian understanding of Jesus' atoning death are striking. The prophecy even predicts that the servant would be assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, which Christians see fulfilled in Jesus being crucified between two criminals but buried in the tomb of wealthy Joseph of Arimathea. However, Jewish interpretation of Isaiah 53 differs significantly from Christian understanding. Traditional Jewish exegesis sees the suffering servant as a personification of the nation of Israel, suffering persecution throughout history, but ultimately vindicated by God. This interpretation predates Christianity and remains the predominant Jewish view today. The debate over Isaiah 53's correct interpretation highlights how the same text can support radically different theological conclusions. The prophecy of Daniel 9:24-27, known as the 70 Weeks prophecy, presents one of the most complex and controversial predictions in biblical literature. This passage appears to provide a timeline for the Messiah's coming and death. Daniel, writing in the 6th century BC, predicts that, after the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. Christian interpreters have calculated various chronologies attempting to show that this timeline points precisely to Jesus' crucifixion in AD 33. Sir Robert Anderson's calculations, using prophetic years of 360 days, concluded that the prophecy predicts Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem to the exact day. However, these calculations involve complex assumptions about dating systems, calendar conversions, and the specific events being referenced. Critical scholars argue that Daniel was actually written during the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, making it history written as prophecy rather than genuine prediction. They point to the book's detailed accuracy regarding events up to the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, followed by inaccuracies about subsequent events, as evidence for this later dating. Conservative scholars maintain the traditional 6th century date and argue that the apparent historical accuracy demonstrates genuine prophetic foreknowledge. The prophecy of the Messiah's lineage presents genealogical claims that both support and complicate Christian arguments. Genesis 49:10 promises that the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. To Samuel 7:12-16 specifically promises David that his dynasty will endure forever, and that one of his descendants will establish an eternal kingdom. Matthew and Luke both provide genealogies, tracing Jesus' lineage through David to Abraham, though their lists differ significantly. Matthew traces descent through Solomon, while Luke goes through Nathan, both sons of David. Traditional explanations suggest that Matthew follows Joseph's legal lineage, while Luke traces Mary's biological ancestry, though this interpretation involves textual assumptions that not all scholars accept. The destruction of temple records in AD 70 eliminated the possibility of verifying first-century genealogical claims, making it impossible to prove or disprove Jesus' Davidic descent through historical documentation. However, the fact that early Christians made these claims in a Jewish context, where genealogy mattered enormously, suggests they believed they could support them, at least at the time they were made. The prophecies concerning the Messiah's rejection by his own people find what Christians see as clear fulfillment in Jesus' experience. Isaiah 53:2-3 states that he was despised and rejected by mankind, while Psalm 118:22 declares that the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Jesus himself quoted this psalm, applying it to his own rejection by religious leaders. The pattern of rejection described in these prophecies matches the gospel narratives precisely. Jesus was rejected by the religious establishment, abandoned by his disciples, and crucified as a criminal. Yet the prophecies also predict ultimate vindication and exaltation. Themes that Christians see, fulfilled in the resurrection and the growth of the early church. Zechariah's prophecies present several specific predictions that Christians claim were fulfilled in Jesus' final week. Zechariah 9:9 describes the Messiah's triumphal entry. Rejoice greatly, daughter Sion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. All four Gospels record Jesus' deliberate fulfillment of this prophecy during his final entry into Jerusalem. Zechariah 11:12-13 predicts that the shepherd Messiah will be valued at 30 pieces of silver, and that this money will be thrown into the house of the Lord and used to buy a potter's field. Matthew's Gospel records that Judas received exactly 30 pieces of silver for betraying Jesus, attempted to return the money to the temple, and that it was ultimately used to purchase a field for burying foreigners. Zechariah 12:10 speaks of a time when they will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. John's Gospel specifically cites this verse in connection with Jesus' crucifixion, noting that Roman soldiers pierced his side with a spear. The resurrection, while not explicitly detailed in specific Old Testament prophecies, is seen by Christians as fulfilling various passages that speak of the Messiah's vindication and eternal reign. Psalm 16:10 declares that God will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. Acts 2:31 presents Peter interpreting this as a resurrection prophecy fulfilled in Jesus. The transformation of Jesus' disciples from fearful, scattered followers to bold proclaimers, willing to die for their beliefs, provides what many see as indirect evidence of prophetic fulfillment. The rapid growth of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, despite persecution and opposition, matches Old Testament predictions about the Messiah's message reaching all nations. However, significant challenges complicate the prophetic fulfillment argument. The dating of Old Testament books remains disputed, with critical scholars arguing that many prophecies were actually written after the events they appear to predict. The phenomenon of prophecy after the fact vaticinium ex eventu was common in ancient literature, making it difficult to distinguish genuine prediction from post-event composition. The selectivity of prophetic interpretation also raises questions. Christians emphasize prophecies that appear to fit Jesus while overlooking or reinterpreting those that don't seem to match. Jewish critics point out that Jesus didn't fulfill many obvious messianic expectations. He didn't establish political independence for Israel, didn't bring universal peace, didn't rebuild the temple, and didn't restore the Davidic kingdom. The hermeneutical question of how prophecy works remains theologically complex. Do prophecies require literal, exact fulfillment, or can they be fulfilled spiritually or symbolically? How specific must a prediction be to constitute genuine prophecy? Can the same prophecy have multiple fulfillments across different historical periods? The Gospel writers' approach to prophecy also influences this discussion. They clearly believe Jesus fulfilled messianic prophecy and shaped their narratives to highlight these connections. Matthew, in particular, repeatedly uses the formula "this was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet," suggesting that demonstrating prophetic fulfillment was a primary concern. This doesn't necessarily invalidate their claims, but it does raise questions about whether their interpretations reflect objective historical analysis or theological conviction. Archaeological evidence provides mixed support for prophetic fulfillment claims. Discoveries have confirmed many historical details mentioned in prophetic and gospel texts. The existence of places like Bethlehem and Nazareth, the practice of crucifixion, The political situation in first-century Palestine. However, archaeology cannot verify the supernatural aspects of prophetic fulfillment or the specific details of Jesus' life. Modern Jewish responses to Christian prophetic arguments remain largely skeptical. Jewish scholars argue that Christian interpretation often takes Hebrew texts out of context, applies Greek philosophical concepts foreign to Hebrew thought, and retrofits prophecies to fit Jesus rather than allowing them to speak on their own terms. They maintain that the true Messiah will fulfill all Messianic prophecies, literally and simultaneously, something Jesus did not accomplish. Conversely, Christian scholars argue that Jewish interpretation fails to account for the concept of the Messiah's two comings, first as a suffering servant, then as a conquering king. They contend that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies related to his first coming precisely, while his second coming will complete the remaining messianic expectations. The statistical arguments for prophetic fulfillment, while impressive on the surface, depend heavily on the assumptions used to calculate probabilities. How many genuine prophecies are there? How specific are they? What constitutes valid fulfillment? Different answers to these questions produce vastly different statistical conclusions. Furthermore, the self-fulfilling nature of some prophecies complicates statistical analysis. If Jesus deliberately acted to fulfill certain prophecies, riding a donkey into Jerusalem, for instance, the probability calculations become meaningless. Only prophecies beyond human control, like birthplace or manner of death, provide meaningful statistical evidence. The question of prophetic fulfillment ultimately intersects with broader questions about the nature of divine revelation, the reliability of ancient texts, and the relationship between faith and historical evidence. For believers, prophetic fulfillment provides confirmatory evidence for convictions held on other grounds. For skeptics, the ambiguities and interpretive challenges in prophetic texts suggest that claims of fulfillment reflect wishful thinking rather than objective proof. What emerges from this investigation is a complex picture that resists simple conclusions. The Hebrew Bible contains numerous passages that, when read through Christian interpretive lens, appear to predict specific aspects of Jesus' life and death with remarkable accuracy. The statistical probability of accidental fulfillment seems astronomically low. The transformation of Jesus' followers and the rapid growth of Christianity suggests that something extraordinary happened to validate their prophetic interpretations. However, alternative explanations for these phenomena remain plausible. Post-event composition of prophecies, selective interpretation of texts, legendary development of gospel narratives, and the self-fulfilling nature of some predictions all complicate claims of supernatural prophetic fulfillment. The fact that intelligent, scholarly people can examine the same evidence and reach opposite conclusions suggests that the question cannot be resolved through purely historical or literary analysis. Perhaps the most important insight from this investigation is that prophetic fulfillment, like many religious claims, exists at the intersection of historical evidence and interpretive faith. The evidence is substantial enough to support belief for those inclined to accept it, yet ambiguous enough to permit rejection by those who approach it skeptically. In the end, the question of whether Jesus fulfilled biblical prophecy may say as much about the interpreter as about the interpreted texts. The debate over prophetic fulfillment continues to influence contemporary discussions about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, the nature of biblical authority, and the role of reason in religious faith. Whether viewed as compelling evidence for Jesus' messianic identity or as an example of creative theological interpretation, these ancient prophecies and their alleged fulfillments remain central to understanding. Christianity emerged from its Jewish roots and developed its distinctive claims about the carpenter from Nazareth who changed the world.